Hello there, and welcome back to Hydroponics Daily, your go-to podcast for everything soilless cultivation. I'm your host, Dr. Russell Sharp, the founder of Utrema Limited. We make interesting fertilizers, novel biostimulants, and organic biopesticides. We're based in the UK, but last week I headed over to Holland, to the Netherlands, to Amsterdam specifically, and even more specifically than that, the Docklands next to the old town. And we went on a visit to Growy, so grow and then a Y on the end. And they are a fairly long established vertical farm based in Amsterdam, but also expanding all around the world. And they're a really interesting vertical farm and hydroponic company for a number of different reasons. And they sort of not your typical vertical farm. So I just wanted to talk about them in more detail, because they were really interesting. The first thing is that they're not backed by a lot of, they're not listed on the stock exchange as far as I'm aware. It's just a couple of private investors and an actual farmer and his daughter that were a family that were started up experimenting with vertical farms back on their farm in about 2016, and then they got a couple of private investors to invest in, and so they work with partners around the world as well to expand. But it's not like your typical, Wall Street, City of London type investment strategy, BlackRock and such like investment houses and hedge funds and stuff like this, and venture capitalists. So that was interesting from that perspective, but also because they were a lot more open about their technology, and they didn't need to sort of lie about their production capacities and things like this, because they weren't trying to get investment. They weren't trying to show they were massively profitable, even though they were doing a really good job at that. So, as I say, it was off in the Docklands of Amsterdam, and in a big, not purpose-built facility, but very close to purpose-built, and they really suited their requirements. They had solar panels on the roof to provide some of the energy that they needed for their farm, and they were providing leafy greens at the moment and microgreens into the Dutch supermarket sector. So not processing, not for food production, and these, as I said in the previous episode, these were on sale at the Jumbo supermarket where I was staying, which is my favourite supermarket. So I was impressed there, and they have a really unique system. So the first thing we saw was actually a growing media facility, manufacturing site that they've actually purchased. It was going into bankruptcy, and the company they were buying their growing media from, so they bought it and sort of integrated their supply chain, as they say. And so you can increase your profitability by doing that, and also, get it on the cheap if it's bankruptcy. And it was a really interesting grow media for a vertical farm. They were getting starches in and then fermenting it to form like an acetate. And then this acetate, this clear white, very fluffy white acetate was their grow media. And then what they had to do, they were growing in gutters, especially purpose, obviously, not just housing gutters, metal gutters. And then to prevent this grow media from growing everywhere, they actually have to heat it and melt the top surface before they sow seeds into it. And so you can imagine this is very airy, so almost like much more airy than even rock wool. And so great for aeration. Downside is that it did tend to get everywhere. So you could see them in the seeding room, with a dustpan and brush and a hoover, hoovering it up where it spilt over the sides. So it's not one solid mass like you would with like a cocoa slab or a rock wool slab, but still very innovative. And it didn't stay white forever. It went a bit brown or black, possibly due to algae growing on it or oxidization. I don't know. But it was underneath the top surface, it was still very white. So a natural sort of fermented, starchy acetate was what they were growing in. So that was really interesting. And then also what was interesting was these robotic robots that would go through the units and monitor all the crops in the gutters and also irrigate them at the same time and then take them off for harvest. And there was a robot for, let me check, I think it was about 20 of the, I think it was about 20, and the gutters were about 3 meters wide So they were monitoring germination, they were irrigating, and they were sending it off for harvest, and they would pick the gutter up to irrigate it. So that unlike normal NFT, where it's sort of in place and a dripper just drips into the slab, this one's actually, they pick up on one side and drip, and then they monitor the outflow on the other side. So that was very interesting. They had automatic filling of the gutters with the grow media, automatic seeding, which is interesting. I think they had a different seeding machine for every different type of plant, because every seed is slightly different. They were doing about 1,000 gutters a day, and they had 2 operators. And this was one of the things that the people discussed on the tour was, you obviously build a hydroponic factory and it involves a lot of engineers building and designing the system. Then how do you transition from a company that's very heavy on engineers and engineering to one that's on farming and less on engineering, expensive engineers? And they seem to square that by expanding into other territories and things like Singapore, a lot of island nations, and they're partnering with investors or supermarkets over in these places to expand. And so that was good. And obviously there needs to be some maintenance of the equipment. And with that, the system they had there, they said that they were producing 60 kilograms per meter squared per year of lettuce and 40 kilograms per meter squared per year for herbs and 35 kilograms per meter squared per year for microgreens. So 60, 40, 35 for lettuce, herbs and microgreens, which is not blown out the water amazing, the world's best ever harvestable yields, but ever claimed, but they're certainly good yields, very good yields, and far higher than you would get in fields, and believable, and something you could build an economical case around. They were growing, one of the herbs they were growing was wasabi mustard, and I've grown a lot of wasabi. Never grown wasabi mustard, which is obviously not true wasabi, but it did taste very similar and had a really good kick, nice delayed kick. That's what you want with wasabi. It's not just an instant acrid taste in the mouth like you get with mustard. You want a delayed kick, and that's what it had. Obviously, the thing that they're focusing on is, we talked about previously, is like pesticide free, no need to wash, no emphasis on hydroponics, really long shelf life, so 18-day shelf life for their lettuce, which is crazy good. And the LED lights were water cooled, which seems to be fairly common now in vertical farms. I've got a brochure here from Dimlux. Remember them, the old Dimlux? Well, they're still going, and they are producing water-cooled LEDs for vertical farming. So they do hybrid cooling, passive air cooling as well. So that's good to see. So water-cooled LEDs were the way forward there. And then obviously they had like heat exchangers for removing the heat from that water and reusing the heat. And they added CO2, and they moved air from one side of this massive factory to the other. And then eventually it would go to an automated packing facility like you would see at any other sort of facility, like you would at an outdoor vegetable producer with the automated fillers. And then lots of people cleaning up and washing up the floors and things like this, because that's something you tend to not get away from. You can't really automate at the moment. And packing is very, very labour intensive at any farm, not to be underestimated. Interestingly, there was a lot of discussion about spinach and arugula. This is an area where it seems a lot of vertical farms are struggling, and I'm going to do an episode about this in the future. A lot of research has been done on this at Lettuce Grow down in Bristol, the aeroponic company, and it's thought that spinach might. Well, there's two reasons, hypotheses as to why spinach is difficult to grow in vertical farms hydroponically. One is that it's allelopathic and it sort of poisons itself and the other plants over time. And the other is that it produces so many root exudates that it builds up a microbial sort of debt, and it becomes anoxic and lack of oxygen in the grow media. And the roots get covered in slime because the bacteria are growing. So that's interesting. And then the reason why basil's not growing is because of the cold chain and getting it to the supermarket and things like that. It needs to be stored in a different way than other herbs. But if you are growing in North America and you're in America, you have to be able to supply spinach if you're supplying lettuce and herbs and microgreens. So it is a big hurdle that people are trying to overcome. They are looking at other crops in the future like strawberries and tomatoes that have added complications because you're going into flowers there and you need pollination, and it's not just leafy veg and things like this. So that's interesting. And what else can we say? They had some lovely offices, lots of places to chill out during their lunch breaks, put table football, even indoor football and hockey. And they had an amazing display of all their locations around the world made from like that moss that you used to get for train sets back in the day. And they did a map of the world with this moss and on the wall. And I thought that was really good. I thought I could do that in my office. So I'm going to have a try at that. So thank you very much to Laura and the team at Growy. It was a really interesting tour. And yeah, they said they were going to do mushrooms in the future. So it'd be really interesting to look at that, because I don't know how you would grow it in the same facility as those plants, because you get terrible fungus gnats and things like this with mushrooms. But obviously you don't need the lights as well. So probably a dedicated facility for growing mushrooms using their system. So the idea being that they could use their robots there for irrigation, picking, monitoring, just as they do for plants, just without the lights. If you've tried to grow mushrooms, it'd be an interesting one for Hydroponics Daily podcast, indoor mushroom cultivation. Can you grow it without any peats or cocoa? Is there a way of doing it almost like hydroponically? I don't know. One to research for another episode. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. If you found it at all useful and you're on Apple Podcast, please leave us a review. If you're on any other podcast provider, a review doesn't really work. It's not really useful. But going onto the Utrema website is extremely useful. And if you're struggling to spell Utrema, it's Latin for wasabi. eutrema.co.uk, and you can find all of our wonderful, amazing, unique, novel products. Trying to get the new auxin solution up there ASAP. Really, really interesting formulation we've created, and it can actually be frozen, and then it solidifies and comes back to life, and it doesn't fall out of solution. If you were to do that with any other auxin solution, it would just crystallize in the bottom and you would never be able to get it back into solution. So we've come across something amazing here, and I think that's going to be a home run, as they say in America. Often when I think of a product's going to be really good and sell really well, it never does. But I'm proud of that formulation, regardless if it sells 1 or 2 bottles a year. I think to come up with a product that's like 8% auxin, that's never been done before. Indole butyric acid is the specific plant hormone that's in there, and to have it super stable to the point where you can freeze it and increase its shelf life dramatically. And so people can just have a super concentrate in their freezer and just take a few drops out every now and again when they need it. I think is a game changer for horticulture. However, you can take a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. So maybe people will carry on using their auxin gels that they've been using for a long time and have degraded in storage, because auxin oxidizes over time. That's why in scientific laboratories it's stored in a brown bottle in the fridge and is remade every 3 weeks. When was the last time you reused your rooting gel and things like that? Anyway, that's for another time. We've actually got round to launching the product. Just a sneak peek there for all my loyal podcast listeners. That's enough waffle for me. Until next time, thank you very much for listening to Hydroponics Daily. Goodbye.